Despite opening on the very same day as Titanic, Tomorrow Never Dies, which was Pierce Brosnan's second turn as James Bond, was another box office hit, eking out $125 million domestically, something like $19 million more than what Goldeneye made, although the worldwide take was slightly less, $339 million, although that was still a great number for 1997. That said, it should be noted that Tomorrow Never Dies cost something like twice the amount of money Goldeneye did. A notoriously fraught shoot, Pierce Brosnan expressed a desire to bring the character back down to earth, so the choice was made to scale this one back into a more serious spy thriller. In it, James Bond protects Electra King, the heiress to an oil empire, from an assassin named Renard, who would be played by Robert Carlyle. Little does he realize Electra is actually in league with the bad guys, with her being a kind of Patty Hearst-style figure, with them planning to use plutonium to cause a nuclear meltdown in Istanbul, which will destroy the Russian oil pipeline and make Electra's empire even more powerful. Basically, it's Goldfinger, but with oil and a female villain. Not a bad idea. To direct, the producers chose Michael Apted, who at the time was primarily known as a documentarian and a director of small-scale dramas like Gorillas in the Mist. The choice of Apted says a lot for how the franchise was operating in the mid-90s. Eon Pictures wanted directors that were efficient, and at the time they were churning out a Bond movie every 2 years. The result was that this left Pierce Brosnan absolutely exhausted, with him getting little time to act in non-Bond films, although he did have a notable hit with his remake of The Thomas Crown Affair in the summer of 1999. Efficiency was valued above all, and Apted himself told Eon that he really had no expertise at all with action, and they famously told him that their second unit crew would take care of all of that. He was to focus on the performances, and therein lies the problem with The World Is Not Enough. Michael Apted, while a solid drama director, just really isn't the guy to put a movie like this together. Apparently, the producers had actually gone to Alphonse Cuarón before, and one wonders what a James Bond movie would have been like with him as a director, although it has to be said at the time Cuarón hadn't really evolved into the huge director that he was, although his movie Great Expectations and A Little Princess were both big critical hits, so I don't know, he might have done something very interesting with this. That said, they wanted a guy that they could control, and with Apted, they got exactly that. Now, this was the first movie that had a screenplay that was written from the start by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, with Bruce Fairstein also having a credit. Now, apparently Purvis and Wade kind of got dropped once Apted came on board, with his wife at the time, Dana Stevens, coming on to beef up the female parts, which was something because, the James Bond movies have often been criticized for not having strong enough female performances, and this was going to be the first James Bond movie where arguably the main villain is a woman. Now, casting Electra King turned out to be something of an ordeal, with a lot of people approached, including a very young Vera Farmiga. Eventually, they decided to go with Sophie Marceau, who was then blowing up after being in Braveheart, starring Mel Gibson. She was a huge star in France, so they had to pay Marceau a lot more money than they were used to paying Bond girls, but the result is right up there on the screen. As mixed a bag as The World Is Not Enough is, Sophie Marceau is absolutely great in the role. She has terrific chemistry with Pierce Brosnan, who really comes to life in his scenes opposite her. She's probably one of the best actresses we've ever had as a Bond girl, and I think her Electra King is extremely memorable. But there are a lot of problems with this movie. I have to say that when I saw it in 1999, I thought it was amazing. In fact, a lot of us did. True Bond fans were somewhat upset with Tomorrow Never Dies because we all felt that there was just too much action and not enough plot. The World Is Not Enough was different. It had a lot of plot, maybe not enough action. Well, that's not exactly fair. There were a lot of good action scenes, including that amazing opening boat chase, but the problem was Michael Apted really had no designs on the action scenes at all. It feels like he just stepped aside and let the second unit crew, which was headed by Vic Armstrong, take over. The movie really doesn't congeal at all. It plays out like a pretty serious drama, and then eventually it just occasionally breaks into big action sequences which don't really have that much to do with the rest of the plot. It's kind of a mess. Now, World Is Not Enough has also a very mixed bag as a cast. A lot of people like Robert Carlyle as the villain Renard, but I always found him to be a glorified henchman. In fact, Javier Bardem was apparently approached to play the part, but he turned it down. Now, Robert Carlyle, of course, was riding high off of The Full Monty and Ravenous, and indeed is probably one of the best actors to ever play a villain, but he just really gets not much at all to do, although they do try to make him somewhat sympathetic.
The bullet will kill him, but he'll grow stronger every day until the day he dies.
Notably, the movie also has a beefed-up role for M, which kind of foreshadows what Judi Dench would get to do in the Daniel Craig movies, as she gets kidnapped by Electra, and Electra, of course, holds a grudge for having been kidnapped by Renard. M apparently told her father, Robert King, who's assassinated at the beginning of the film, not to pay the ransom, leaving her with the disfigurement, with the bad guys cutting off part of her ear and sending it to her father to induce him to pay. This actually comes right from what happened to the Gettys, which of course was dramatized in All the Money in the World. Now, where the film gets really controversial is in the choice of the second Bond girl, Dr. Christmas Jones, who would be played by Denise Richards. Now, Denise Richards' performance in the movie is quite cartoonish. She's not extremely believable as a nuclear physicist, I mean, not at all. But you also have to remember that Denise Richards at the time was probably the #1 pinup in the world. I mean, she had really broken out big time in Starship Troopers and then especially Wild Things. I mean, God, when I was a kid, I thought Denise Richards was just an absolute goddess. So when I heard she was starring in a James Bond movie, oh, I was excited, and all my friends were excited too.
It's another day at the office.
But an actress, she was really good in movies like Drop Dead Gorgeous, Undercover Brother, and Wild Things, but she just really doesn't suit playing a nuclear physicist, and her performance is unfortunately something that craters the film and makes it hard to rewatch. In fact, I'll say this. As I said earlier, I kind of liked The World Is Not Enough when it came out. I thought it was one of the grittiest James Bond movies ever, but something funny happened. The second time I watched it, I didn't like it as much. Years later, I ended up actually working on the Blu-ray of this movie, doing quality control on the subtitles, so I had to watch the movie over and over again. In fact, I had to watch a lot of the James Bond movies like this, and even the worst installments, ones like Moonraker, which I had to watch over and over again, I still love. I can still watch Moonraker anytime, even though it's not really considered one of the best Bond movies. But World Is Not Enough, I watched so many times that after a certain point, I just couldn't stand watching it anymore. It just fell apart on repeat viewings, and I don't know why. It just doesn't really hold up. It's episodic, and it's also quite dull between the action scenes, which themselves are totally unexceptional, except for the boat chase at the beginning of the movie, which really stands as one of the only moments in the film to really come to life. It's not Pierce Brosnan's fault. Breaking the movie down a bit, I will say this. Pierce Brosnan is very engaged in his performance here. He's really good as James Bond, especially in his scenes with Electra. But the problem with his role as Bond in this is that he seems to have some kind of duality. When he's with Electra, you feel that Bond is really getting emotionally involved with her, and he seems devastated when he has to kill her at the end. But then he kind of slips back into like the James Bond happy-go-lucky vibe at the end of the movie with his horrible, horrible double entendre to Christmas Jones being,
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
I mean, this one went over my head when I was younger, but boy, oh boy, is it silly. And you know, if James Bond has been through this kind of emotional ordeal, the end of the movie shouldn't end with him making cheeky double entendres. I think the Daniel Craig movies got this right, you know, where at the end of the movie, sometimes he was shaken up and not, you know, ready to throw off a one-liner. In some ways, this is a preview of what was to come or a dry run, but it just doesn't really work in this film. I give Pierce Brosnan something like a 7 on 10. I think he really gives it his best, but I think some of the things I don't like about Pierce Brosnan also show up in this movie. He has some tics that have always kind of bothered me, particularly his weird hurt acting, you know, where he goes when he's being tortured. He does a lot of that in The World Is Not Enough, which I always find kind of funny. That said, you know, he gives it his all, and I think that if Brosnan had been given some really top flight material, he would have probably been one of the best James Bonds ever, but unfortunately, outside of Goldeneye, his movies just were never really that good. In terms of the Bond girls, again, very mixed bag. I'm not going to count Electra King, actually, as a Bond girl, because I think she's really the villain in the movie, so that leaves us with Denise Richards as Christmas Jones, who, as I said, looks beautiful. I mean, she looks like Laura Croft, but her performance is really bad, and I'd say she's probably one of the worst James Bond girls ever. I give her a 4 on 10. I'm sorry, Denise, I still love you. The villains. Sophie Marceau is great as Electra King, probably one of my favorite James Bond villains ever, but they kind of chicken out at the end. She's built up as the main villain, but then they kind of kill her off and we're left to deal with Renard as the main baddie at the end of the film. So it's divided between James Bond fans with who's actually the main villain in this movie. I've always thought it was Electra King, but a lot of people and the canon suggest that it's actually Renard, who really doesn't fit the bill. I mean, he's a glorified henchman at best. So I give the villains a 7 on 10. I think Sophie Marceau is amazing, but I also think she should have been given more to do in the movie. What the movie does have, however, is another really good score by David Arnold, who was really coming into his own at the time. He had famously been hired to compose the soundtrack for Tomorrow Never Dies, and that was a highlight of the movie, and he's back in The World Is Not Enough, doing kind of a more mellow John Barry-esque score. You don't really have any propeller heads in this one, but it does have a great theme song by Garbage, which I think stands as one of the better James Bond theme songs of the time. It also ends with a Scott Walker song. Well, at least the soundtrack ends with a Scott Walker song. It doesn't actually turn up in the movie, because it was a little too moody, I think. One of the things this movie also did was that it introduced John Cleese's R. You see, at the time, Desmond Llewellyn was getting older, and there was some concern that he wasn't going to be able to play Q for much longer. So Cleese was brought in as R to serve as kind of his successor, not replacement, because the intention was never to replace Desmond Llewellyn with R. The problem is with this, R is really just kind of a goofier version of Q. Desmond Llewellyn was special in the role. Nobody was quite like him, and he had this wonderful chemistry with every actor that played James Bond. They all really liked him, and you could tell, especially with Roger Moore. And Timothy Dalton also, just there was something about him. He had kind of a fatherly relationship with Bond, and you always knew that no matter what happened, Q was there to help Bond out, which I think was most touchingly portrayed in License to Kill, where Bond goes rogue, and of course, reliable Q shows up to give him gadgets and even do a little bit of undercover work. So The World Is Not Enough has a really bittersweet moment where Q basically tells James Bond that he's thinking about hanging it up at a certain point and advises him,
first, never let them see you bleed.
And the second?
Always have an escape plan.
It's a beautiful little scene, but what would be really sad was that Desmond Llewellyn died in a freak car accident a few months later. Nobody ever intended this to be his last James Bond movie, but that's just how it turned out. And while his exit scene is really good, it's a heartbreaker because I grew up absolutely loving him in the role. And it's too bad that he died in such a weird way, because I think the intention was always to bring him back. And we were left with John Cleese as R, who I never really liked, and I just thought he was too over the top in the part. John Cleese is good, he's funny, but he doesn't belong in a James Bond movie. It's just too goofy. In terms of action, there's really not a lot of it. It's got some big action set pieces, but it's all done by, the second unit crew. It's efficiently done, but there's nothing really memorable outside of that opening boat chase. Although, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this film is that it has the longest pre-credit sequence ever, because the boat chase apparently was supposed to come after the theme song, which would have just left them with that little part in Bilbao, Spain, where Bond kind of escapes from an office, which would have been a really dull opening. Although he wears these really cool sunglasses at one point that I really wanted. I wanted a pair of those badass sunglasses, and I can never find them. The boat chase is great, but the rest of the movie just can't live up to it. All this, I have to say, adds up to one of the most disappointing James Bond entries ever. Again, it was a movie that I liked as a kid, and I thought was pretty good originally when it came out, but just hasn't really held up too well. I give this one a 5 on 10. It really is one of my least favorite James Bond movies, and, it's slightly better than what was to come, unfortunately, for Pierce Brosnan, with Die Another Day, of course, being something we're really going to have to unpack in the next episode. But World Is Not Enough, a very bland entry. Yet, the movie was actually a box office hit, with it grossing $126 million, which was $1 million more than what Tomorrow Never Dies made. It also made $362 million worldwide, smashing franchise records. So clearly audiences still love Pierce Brosnan as 007, even though I think we can all look back and say that this was kind of a harbinger of things to come. They needed some new blood, unfortunately. GoldenEye was a great Pierce Brosnan movie, but he never really got his due, and we would see just how disastrous a James Bond movie could be with the next installment, which of course we're going to go into in our next James Bond Revisited, which will be one of the most explosive episodes ever. If you like this video and you like the James Bond Revisited series, make sure to click on the bell to receive notifications every time we post a new video. We're an independent company, and you know what? We appreciate all of your support.